Hello, LAB02. Messing around with a voltage controlled switch. You are going to need to use what I wrote in Canvas because that tells you when you need to write a little bit in your journal and when and what to capture in Logic, and that's the stuff that gets graded. There are 4 required parts for the lab and then a 5th part that will get you the extra 20% that you can mess with if you want. What we're going to use is 2 oscillators, a voltage controlled switch, a mixer, and then a final VCA. Then later we're going to bring some more stuff in. So I'm thinking of this as VCO1 and this as VCO2, even though it doesn't really matter. This is the voltage controlled switch, the Q128. We have 2 of them. Each Q128 has 2 switches, a top and a bottom, but they are, unfortunately, controlled by the same control signal. And I understand why the guy did that, to save money, not charge as much. I think it would have made a lot more sense to charge a bit more and put a second control input in them. On the other hand, for an inexpensive switch, it's better to have actually 2 of them in there than 1, even if they are both controlled with the same control signal. So each section, top and bottom, are the same, and they can be used in different directions. So in other words, you could bring sound A into jack A, sound B into B, and then what would come out of the common depends on the control state, the red button or a gate signal going in. You can also feed a signal into the common and it will go out A or B, depending. A quick note here about the difference between a voltage controlled switch and a sequential switch. We have 3 sequential switches, Q962s. The voltage controlled switch only switches to its other state when a gate going in is held high at 5 volts. When the gate goes to 0, it switches back. The sequential switch, you can ping the shift input with a trigger, a 5 millisecond trigger, and it will shift to a different input and just hold there until it receives another trigger. So they're different, both usable. So what you're going to do is start off with VCO1 range at 8, frequency at 0. VCO2 range at 4, frequency at 0. You're going to take the triangle outputs of both and come into an input of the switch. So for instance, this is into input A, this is into input B. Depending on whether this button is pressed or this is at 0 or 5 volts will determine what comes out here. It'll be one of them. We're going to bring this into a mixer right here. And that's going to go to your VCA. Now, you're not using pitch voltage from the MIDI interface. You can if you want, but I would start off just letting them drone, tuned the same, an octave apart. I'm using this mixer because later on you're going to bring in other sounds, and we've got 3 mixers, 1, 2, 3, not, well, counting number 4, which is a, more elaborate. The thing I like about the Moon 526 is that each channel is individually switchable on-off and they're bipolar control, so it's great for when you're mixing control voltages, which we're not doing today, but there you go. Now you need a way to modulate the switch, and we're going to use VCO3 as an LFO, so you're going to set this in the LFO range. I would set the rate right up to about halfway and come out of the positive output. I forget which one's positive, it's one of these, not that it matters, and come into the control input. For now, set this on the Q141 at square wave and turn the level up all the way. Turn this switch on, turn this level up all the way clockwise, turn the master output level all the way up, and then come here to the initial gain or gain and turn it up, halfway, just so that it's droning. It'll be going back and forth between the two. What you're going to do is you're going to take the level control of the Q141 oscillator aid that's controlling the amplitude of the modulating signal here, and start turning it down, and it'll be sounding just totally normal, but around in here it'll start changing. If you turn it all the way down, the switch will stop modulating. It will just hold on whichever one. I think it holds on B if you have an input with 0 volts. Start turning this up, and you'll hear somewhere around 3 something interesting starts to happen. To compare it, turn it up to about 6 suddenly. Listen, then turn it down to around 3 and adjust it really finely up and around that 3 area. Now, to make it easier to hear what's going on, something you could do is you could temporarily say, take VCO1, shift the range up to 4, and move the frequency control up or down a notch so that they're out of tune and they're beating against each other, okay? Another thing that you could do is, I don't care, but if you wanted, you could take the pitch voltage into, say, one of these and then change the note that just one of the oscillators is playing against the steady note until you get something kind of dissonant, something easy to really hear. So what I want you to do now, still not recording, is switch this from square to pulse. When you go to pulse, the width control becomes active. So in other words, if you set your width at, say, 30% and 70, you could switch back and forth between pulse and square here, and it would always be 50% on square wave. So for this next part, turn the output level all the way back up, switch the wave output to pulse, and then mess around with the width. Hear what happens when it's at 0%, at 100%, and then mess around with it. At this point, you may want to increase your frequency up to +1 or +2. Now, once you've done that, as you're changing the width control, also change the level of the Q141 output. Put it around 3 and change it so you're hearing that thing that it does while you're changing the width. Now, jot down in your journal 2 or 3 or 4 sentences. What was happening? What do you think? And then audio 1 capture is going to be letting this play for probably 12-15 seconds while you're adjusting the pulse width of the pulse wave output and adjusting this some around 3 and also turning it all the way up, leaving it for a second, then turning it all the way down, no modulation, okay? Okay, there's one more part for part 1. If you look in Canvas, you'll see there's 3 things that you need to write and 1 audio capture. So we've done the first 2 writings and the audio capture. Here's the last thing you just listen to and then write what's happening. Set the volume of the 141 all the way up, put it in square, and have these tuned as we did at the beginning, 8-foot range, 4-foot range, tuned roughly the same, triangle outs. Part 1 for Lab 2 goes journal entry, audio capture, journal entry. It's so much easier to show you for the last journal entry. It's just something you do. It's quick. I know that originally I mispatched this because I couldn't see it on the screen. So these are the triangles, right? All you do is you go up to the 2 oscillators while it's playing. Put your hands on both outputs from oscillators. Go from the triangle to the sawtooth and listen. The idea is you're listening here. Go to the sawtooth and just listen. Back to the triangle. Go to the sine wave. Go back. Now, take the range controls of the oscillators, click them down 1. So they both go down an octave. Do the same thing. Listen to saw, listen to triangle, listen to sine. Come back to triangle, restore the range switches, write down what you heard, couple 3 sentences. You're ready to move on to part 2. Okay, here's part 2. There's no writing, it's just a single audio capture. What you're going to do, and you may have already done this in EMT, but now you're formally being shown. You're being shown how to use the mod wheel on the Prophet as a control source for anything in the modular that can receive a control voltage. So if you look at the Prophet, you'll see a couple of wheels on the left side, and beneath one it says mod. I would hope you know that's the mod wheel, modulation, and it's controller 1. So what you're going to do is turn the mod wheel on the Prophet all the way down. And because we're doing a new set here, I'm going to go ahead and put in some settings here. So this was at 8 foot, this was at 4 foot. These were both roughly the same. This has no settings. And this, the mixer was all the way up. And it was on, and this was roughly at half or something like that. And always leave this here at linear, just trust me on that. And then for the LFO, it's in low range, and it's some range between here and here, depending on your druthers and the part of the assignment you're doing. What you're going to do for part 2 is put the wave select output in pulse and the width about the middle. And also, you're going to use this exponential control voltage input or pitch input and set this up around somewhere between here and here, not right around the middle or somewhere. You can adjust it to taste later. Look at the little Roland MPU half rack box that is just to the left of the Prophet. Make sure switch number 1 is pressed. Press a key. You should see this gate button light up. Then you're going to want to put this mode switch in 3. So what that mode switch does This mode switch controls the behavior of all three of these. So in mode 1, all of these do a certain thing. I think you can get aftertouch and some other stuff. In mode 2, these become a second set of pitch, gate, and velocity outputs on MIDI channel 2. So you can use this duophonically. In mode 3, you get the mod wheel out here. You get, I think, controller 7 volume here and controller 4 there, which is foot pedal. So now what you're going to do, take the output of this jack and run it into the exponential in. That's it. Turn the Q141 level all the way up and just leave it. You're not going to mess with that. Then, with your right hand on the mod wheel of the Prophet and your left hand on the pulse width of the LFO, you're going to mess around with both of them simultaneously. But before you do, what I recommend is that scaling is something that took me a little bit to learn, and once you learn it, it's wicked easy. You had an LFO here that you would put manually into a certain speed and a certain range, get what you want, right? Now you're introducing a variable. You're introducing an external control source. So you don't know if this is scaled correctly. In other words, with the wheel all the way down and then the wheel all the way up, this range may not suit you. So what I suggest you do is turn the mod wheel all the way down. You'll hear it going, and set this frequency down to about the slowest you want it. And that's the one place you'll leave it. Don't worry about this here. Get rid of that. Then what you do is turn the mod wheel all the way up, turn this exponential rate. Why are there two here? That's because of me. Turn it all the way down so that the speed of the LFO is staying exactly the same still. Now with the mod wheel all the way up, start turning this knob up until it's going the fastest that you want it to. So now what you've done is you've scaled it. With the mod wheel all the way down, it's the slowest speed you want. With the mod wheel all the way up, it's the fastest speed you want. So here's what to mess around with, after which you will do the capture, which is part 2 capture. Again, with the level all the way up, you put your right hand on the mod wheel and your left hand on the width. I know I already said that. And adjust them both at the same time, but what I'm not looking for is like up, down, up, down, up, down. It's more like changing them somewhat slowly, like, slowly over 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds each in different directions and stuff, and hear what's happening. Now, you may want to take this and tune them to some dissonant interval or some other interval. Offsetting VCOs can be really handy, and it's really easy once you figure out how to do it. Let's pretend that you've got both of these tuned an octave apart. You're tracking them from a keyboard. You got the pitch CV into both, and you've played the lowest C note on the Prophet. So they're both droning at C. So far, so good. Now pretend you had a second keyboard, a second Prophet, with its own pitch output, and that pitch output was coming only into a parallel 1-volt tracking octave of only the second oscillator. So if keyboard 1 and 2 both played the lowest C, it would sound exactly the same. But then if on the second keyboard you played, for instance, an A above the lowest C, this would go up a major sixth, right? And you could instantly transpose this to different octaves and different intervals. Well, there's an easy way to do this. This offset module, down here and up here, I usually save the top portion for other things because it's got the plus or minus 200% attenuverter. So this just puts out -5 to +5 volts. Use the quantizer. Put this switch in the middle. Note that the way the quantizer is set, it will not process negative voltages. Come out of here, offset out into quantizer in. Quantizer out into exponential adjustable in. I have a reason for doing this. Bring the exponential level all the way up. And then as you turn this offset knob, from 0 down, nothing will happen because, again, this doesn't process negative voltages. But from 0 up, that will be the equivalent of what I explained, that this will suddenly change. Now, if you find that you have too wide a range here and it's hard for you to easily dial in individual notes because it goes up an entire 5 octaves, you can take your exponential level, for instance, and bring it down halfway. And then this will have, it won't go up as high, but it'll have a wider range. And that's something really handy because these Q106 oscillators, I love them. They're great. But one thing that's not great is that as it stands with an octave range switch and a fine tune. The fine tune, you can get a major third up around 3 and a perfect fourth a bit below 4, less than 4. But when you go all the way up to 5, it is noticeably sour flat of a perfect fifth. So this is a way that you can take care of that. For part 3, we're going to mess around with some band-limited noise. So let's set the LFO. Again, this should be all the way up. Let's set it to a square wave. And, the rate somewhere, 6, around 6. I'm not going to bust your cookies. Somewhere in there, okay? So it's going, so far so good. What we're going to do is feed the output of this noise. You can take white or pink, I don't care, into an input of the filter bank, the low input, which will put more gain on it. Now, the thing is, we're going to use these individual outputs. And the thing to remember is that, look, if noise has all frequencies and an individual output is severely band limited, doesn't it make sense that the output level of each of these will be very low? And they are. They're about 12 dB down compared to what would come out of the main outs if all of these knobs were all the way up. So what I suggest you do is come into the input of the instrument interface and set it to times 10 and all the way up. So it's a nice 10 dB boost, and then come out of the amplifier output and bring that into the low. Okay, so now go and find 1K. I think this is it. 1K output. Bring this down here into input 2 of the mixer. Turn it on, turn it all the way up, and you'll be hearing, besides you'll hear. Now, while you're just listening to that, take this and manually try different. Then that is basically going to be your capture. So put it in record, name it, put it in the marker, name it part 3, and while it's recording, you're going to be hearing this. Now, you don't have to do this next part. That can be 3, but if you're kind of adventurous, just a little, you could take another LFO, like this one, say, put it in low, and let's make it pretty slow, put it at 3, and take an output, let's say bring the output of the sine wave up into the pulse width modulation input. You'll have to set this away from square and to pulse, whichever one is pulse, set it to pulse, and set the width to the middle, and then set the pulse width CV level not all the way up or else it'll disappear, but somewhere up in here. So now you'll have this slowly modulating, and then do this, change this while it's recording. Give me 15 seconds or so of that. That'll be part 3. All right, for part 4, gonna have some fun here. If you decided optionally to have this LFO modulating the pulse width of your main LFO, get rid of that or turn the level all the way down so it is not being modulated, which won't matter actually now that I think about it, because we're going to put this in square. Whichever one of these is square, I want a square wave. And let's set the tempo up at around 1. And we're going to get rid of these oscillators. Okay, we're going to use 4 outputs, and I'm going to give you certain frequencies that I'd like you to start with. You can leave the frequencies as I give them to you, or you can change them, but for the start, please do this. Let's go, whichever one of these is 500, folks. I really don't remember. If 500, okay, whichever one is 500. Let's put that into top A, and let's take 1K into top A and B. Then I want 1.4K and 750, which is in between. So it's 4 in a row. They're very close frequency bands into bottom B. Now, obviously, you're going to need to connect the output of the bottom section into channel 2 of the Moon Mixer module. So as usual, what I would like you to do is mess around with what I'm giving you. Just listen to it, play around with it, and then do the capture, okay? Because the capture is just me going, okay, you did it, fine. Initially, turn, say, channel 2 on the mixer off, and you'll only be hearing, and then you can actually put, in one hand, you can put, say, your index finger on this and your thumb on this, and you can simultaneously switch off one while the other. So compare the two, and then turn both on and listen. And then mess around with the rate control, but you should be able to do it with the mod wheel on the profit, right? So put your left hand on the profit mod wheel and turn these on and off. And the third thing is leave the rate alone. You can speed it up maybe a little bit, so something like that. And let's just start with one of these on and then bring this level down. You'll hear it's a lot more noticeable with the noise. Bring it down and slowly change it and listen to what's happening. And then while you're slowly changing this output level with your left hand, turn on each of these separately and together. It's perfectly fine with me if while you're doing the capture, you also once in a while reach up and grab one of these and change it over to here. Or whatever you want, something like that. So this capture, the fourth one, the longest one that's required, this, I'd like a good maybe, 30 seconds of you messing around. And again, I'm not looking for manic, real fast changes that just sounds like chaos. They don't have to be real slow changes, but things that change over at least a second or two or three or four, so I can hear what you're doing when I listen. Okay, so that is actually the last required part of the lab. Part 5 is optional. Part 5 is you playing around and having fun. You don't necessarily have to do anything. The only rules are it needs to convey enough effort to earn you the extra 20 points. Nothing crazy. I would hope for maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes. So let me just give you a couple of ideas. Now, what you're going to have to do if you do part 5 is you're going to have to write. If you'll notice in this assignment, you had to write 3 things for part 1. You haven't written since. So if you do the optional part, you have to write down what you did for me. I would like it if you actually graphicked it out in Modular Grid, but you don't have to as long as you write it out for me. So let me give you some ideas here, just making this up as I go. We've got stuff going back and forth here, 2 different things. So let's get rid of a couple of these. So now we've just got one. And let's take those and feed them into a sequential switch. And then let's take the output of that sequential switch into A. And then let's take a couple of more bands into another sequential switch. And we'll feed the output of that switch into input B. Now, this is going to be going at one rate, so you don't want these going as fast as this is going. Otherwise, it would always sound the same. If that doesn't make sense, try it and you'll see what I mean. So what we want to do is we want to ping these switches just every once in a long while. So what you could do easily is you could take the output of your LFO, and since it's a square wave, you could mult it like this, or just use the inverted output. It really won't matter. For the sake of ease, let's just take the inverted output and run it into the shift input number 1 of the trigger sequencer. Now this is going to be going at the rate of the LFO. So you could take 1 and shift this, and you could take, say, row 2 and shift this, and then you could just say, turn on switch 1 here, and turn on switch 4 on row 2, and then you're going to be making a pattern. So there's one idea. Here's another idea. You could come into, instead of the trigger sequencer, you could come into the clock divider. Now, this is going to give you these clock divisions, and these hold high for the whole time they're on. They're not triggers, they're actual gates. So this way, instead of shifting these from the trigger sequencer, you could get strange subdivisions and shift them. You're going to find an issue though, I think. I just tried it, and actually this does work exactly like this. Any of these outputs will correctly shift to 962. And because the output is high for the entire time that the gate is on, in other words, it's not a trigger, I thought it would also work, say, to switch this separate Q128 switch, which conveniently is right next to the filter bank. This does not work. So in that case, you would have to do the trick of coming into one of the two Q125 signal processors and then boosting the gain to 200%, and then this will correctly work at that point. So what I'm looking for part 5 is for you to play around and have fun. You can use my ideas, you can use different ones and change them. Just remember to write them down, and I hope you have fun. And then that's part 5 and completes lab 2.